The morning sun lit up the glass facade of the downtown bank, casting reflections of passing cars and hurried pedestrians onto its polished doors, but inside the atmosphere was anything but warm. The bank manager, Linda Parker, prided herself on running her branch like a fortress, strict, orderly, and in her mind, reserved for the right kind of clientele. That morning, as the line of customers shuffled forward, a tall black man in a neat, gray suit stepped inside, holding a leather briefcase with the kind of composure that drew attention. His name was David Carter, though Linda never bothered to ask. He approached the counter calmly, sliding his ID and documents toward the teller with a polite smile, requesting to finalize a wire transfer. But Linda, watching from across the room, narrowed her eyes. She stepped forward, heels clicking sharply on the marble floor, and with a tone dripping with suspicion, asked, "Sir, are you sure you're in the right place? Transactions of this size require special clearance." David's brow furrowed, his voice calm but firm. "I've provided all the documentation. This transfer is urgent. Could you please process it?" Linda barely glanced at the papers before pushing them back with a dismissive wave. "I'm sorry, but we can't process this request today. Perhaps you should try another branch, one better suited for unusual cases." Her words were coated in condescension, the kind that implied more than they said, and customers nearby shifted uncomfortably, sensing the sting of prejudice beneath her smile. David inhaled slowly, not raising his voice, not creating a scene. He simply gathered his documents, nodded once, and turned toward the exit. Linda smirked, satisfied, believing she had protected her bank from a potential problem. But what she didn't know, what no one in that branch realized, was that David Carter wasn't just another customer. He was a senior federal auditor conducting a covert assessment of discriminatory practices in financial institutions, and Linda's arrogance had just triggered a chain of events that would leave the entire branch in chaos within minutes. The lobby of the branch seemed to tighten as the bank manager, a sharp-suited woman named Victoria Hensley, approached with a look that blended irritation and false courtesy. She didn't ask questions. She simply looked Marcus up and down as though deciding whether he belonged. "Is there a problem here?" she asked curtly, her voice loud enough for the gathered clients to hear. The teller stammered about Marcus's request, but Victoria cut her off. "Sir, perhaps you should try another branch. We're quite busy with important clients today." Her words weren't just dismissive. They carried a weight meant to humiliate. The room stirred, a few clients shifting uncomfortably while others smirked, emboldened by her tone. Marcus, calm as ever, asked her directly, "Is my money not important enough for this bank? Or is there another reason I'm being denied service?" Victoria's lips pressed into a thin smile, the kind meant to mask disdain. "It's not about importance. It's about procedures. You don't seem to have the right credentials." The irony, of course, was that Marcus had already presented every necessary document. The teller had quietly confirmed his identity moments before. But Victoria wasn't concerned with rules, she was concerned with appearances, and to her, Marcus didn't look like the type of man who could command millions. He didn't fit her definition of power or wealth. The air thickened with tension as Marcus repeated, slower this time, "Are you refusing me service because of how I look?" His voice resonated through the lobby, causing a few clients to glance up from their phones and papers. Victoria scoffed, her patience thinning, and waved her hand as though swatting away a nuisance. "I'm refusing you service because I don't believe you're who you claim to be. Now, if you don't leave, I'll have security escort you out." Gasps rippled across the floor, and the teller's face turned pale. Even she knew Marcus had been properly verified. But Victoria's words weren't about truth, they were about dominance. She wanted to remind Marcus that, in her branch, her word was law. She leaned closer, lowering her voice, so only he could hear. "Men like you shouldn't play games with institutions like ours. We can make things very difficult." It was the kind of quiet threat Marcus had heard all his life, but what Victoria didn't realize was that this time she wasn't talking to someone powerless. He straightened his posture, his eyes locking on hers, not with anger, but with a calm authority that made her blink. "Very well," Marcus said, his voice smooth, steady, and carrying across the lobby. "If this is how you choose to treat me, then let's see how difficult things will get for you." His words weren't shouted, but the weight behind them carried like thunder. The tension snapped. Some clients began whispering, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Victoria rolled her eyes, dismissing him as though he were bluffing, but her fingers twitched at her side, betraying unease. She had no idea who Marcus was, no clue that with every dismissive word, she was unraveling not just her own career, but the foundation of the branch itself. The air inside the branch shifted after the confrontation. The manager's smug dismissal still lingered in the silence, but now a strange tension was creeping in. Customers whispered in low tones, some recording quietly with their phones, while others shifted uncomfortably as though they were unsure whose side to be on. Marcus remained seated near the customer service desk, calm and collected, his posture unshaken despite the sting of humiliation. He pulled out his phone, tapped a few commands, and within minutes, it seemed as though the walls of the branch themselves began closing in. First, the card readers at the teller windows blinked, flashed red, and suddenly froze. Transactions halted mid-swipe, leaving customers stranded with receipts that printed half-complete and credit slips that refused to process. The assistant manager, pale and flustered, tried rebooting the systems, but every screen returned an error message. The security guard, uneasy, whispered to the manager, who waved him off, though sweat was now beading on his forehead. Within another 5 minutes, the ATMs inside the lobby went dark, spitting out cards and cash before shutting down altogether. People rushed to grab their belongings, muttering anxiously about lost money. The manager, red-faced, barked orders at his team, but every attempt to call the bank's IT support was met with a deadline. Phones went static, even the branch's Wi-Fi went offline. And yet, Marcus sat there quietly, not saying a word, his presence a steady reminder of the insult just delivered. The panic grew when a woman shouted that her account had suddenly been locked, and another man yelled that his online banking app was inaccessible. By then, murmurs filled the air, words like hack, shut down, and fraud rippled across the crowd. The branch that had so confidently dismissed one man only moments earlier was now unraveling in chaos. Employees darted across the floor, customers grew restless, and the once pristine order of the bank was collapsing like dominoes. For the first time, the manager's confident smirk faltered. He looked over at Marcus, who finally met his gaze with calm, steady eyes, as though silently telling him that the cost of arrogance was about to be paid in full. By the time the clock ticked past noon, the chaos inside the branch had spilled far beyond its glass doors. Outside, a crowd had gathered, drawn by the shouting, the frantic movements of staff, and the growing line of customers who couldn't withdraw their money. News traveled fast in the city. People came rushing from nearby shops, some pulling out their phones to live stream, others demanding answers from staff who had none. Inside, the tension felt electric. The hum of malfunctioning machines was drowned out by the noise of customers banging on counters, insisting their funds had vanished. The assistant manager, now visibly shaking, tried to calm a furious businessman who had been in the middle of a 7-figure transfer when the system collapsed. "This is a federal offense," the man shouted, his voice booming across the lobby, and others echoed his anger. The manager, desperate to regain control, stormed over to Marcus, his voice lowered but his words dripping with hostility. "What did you do?" he hissed, as though Marcus had pressed some invisible button that brought the empire of numbers to its knees. But Marcus didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head, his silence a far sharper response than any argument could provide. Meanwhile, calls were being made frantically, but the branch's landlines buzzed with static, and cell phones were strangely useless inside the building, leaving everyone cut off. That's when the first signs of something larger appeared. Armored vans screeched to a halt outside, not carrying cash, but federal auditors escorted by agents in dark suits. The crowd outside roared with curiosity as the officials entered, their badges flashing, demanding immediate access to the bank systems and accounts. Employees froze, some gasped, The lead auditor announced, loud enough for all to hear, that this branch had been flagged in an ongoing investigation for fraudulent practices and that its systems had been quietly monitored for months. Every eye in the room turned, not to the auditors, not to the trembling staff, but to Marcus, who sat with quiet dignity as if he had known this storm was always coming. Panic twisted into fear as the manager's face went pale. His protests turned to stutters as the agents asked for his office keys and ordered staff to step aside. Customers cheered, some clapping, others shaking Marcus's hand in gratitude, though they didn't yet know who he really was. The balance of power had shifted. The mighty institution brought low not by an accident, but by the arrogance of those who thought they could humiliate a man without consequence. And as the investigators wheeled and servers sealed files and secured the vault, Marcus finally stood, straightening his jacket, his presence commanding the room without a single spoken word. The boardroom at the central office of Sterling National Bank was supposed to be a sanctuary of power where men in tailored suits and women in designer blazers orchestrated billion-dollar moves with calm precision, but that morning it felt like a courtroom awaiting judgment. The CEO, Richard Sterling himself, sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his silver hair combed meticulously, his eyes cold with fury. Across from him sat Angela, the regional director, who oversaw the very branch that had denied service to Darius, a man whose quiet strength had set off a chain reaction they hadn't anticipated. The news of the incident had spread like wildfire. Blogs picked it up, social media turned it viral, and the bank's biggest corporate partners had already begun pulling out of meetings. Darius wasn't just a random customer. He was a major investor whose portfolio touched nearly every corner of the financial sector, and his silence since walking out of the branch spoke louder than any statement. Panic rippled through the leadership. Phones buzzed, emails flooded, and even the legal department whispered about potential lawsuits. Angela tried to defend herself, claiming her manager acted under protocol, but her excuses were drowned out by Richard slamming his palm on the polished table. Protocol doesn't humiliate investors, he growled, his voice carrying the weight of decades in finance. Around the room, directors avoided eye contact, their pens tapping nervously against notepads as they realized the reputation Sterling Bank had built over generations was teetering on the edge of collapse because of arrogance and prejudice. Outside the glass walls of the boardroom, employees whispered in hushed tones, rumors mixing with fear as stock prices slipped and analysts on financial news channels speculated about the bank's stability. For the first time in years, Sterling National wasn't the predator, it was the prey, and the world was watching hungrily. Meanwhile, across the city, Darius sat in his quiet penthouse office, sipping coffee as he reviewed reports from companies he owned, his phone lighting up with messages from competitors eager to win his favor. He hadn't lifted a finger yet, but the bank's empire was already cracking under its own weight, and every executive in that boardroom knew it. The following morning dawned with a tension that hung over the city like a storm cloud, and by 9 o'clock the headquarters of Sterling National Bank was in complete chaos. Reporters crowded the steps, their microphones pointed at the glass doors, shouting questions about racism, discrimination, and whether the century-old institution was collapsing from the inside. Inside, the boardroom was no longer just tense, it was frantic. Overnight, for corporate partners had withdrawn millions in funds, and whispers spread that even government regulators were preparing to launch an investigation. Angela sat pale and trembling, her excuses exhausted, while Richard Sterling's face had hardened into a mask of iron fury. "We need to fix this," he barked, though everyone knew it was too late for a quick repair. Someone finally whispered the name they'd all been avoiding, Darius. He wasn't just a client. He was a financial force, a quiet titan who could single-handedly tilt markets with a word. The irony was bitter. They had treated him as if he were beneath them, only to discover he was higher on the ladder than all of them combined. The public was demanding an apology, the shareholders were demanding stability, and Richard, desperate to save the empire his family had built, ordered a delegation to reach out to Darius personally. But While the bank scrambled, Darius was meeting with a rival institution, his calm presence filling the room as executives from Titan Financial nearly stumbled over themselves to offer him terms that others could only dream of. He listened politely, his expression unreadable, though every nod from him sent ripples of panic across Sterling's leadership once word leaked that he was entertaining competitors. By midday, financial channels carried headlines: Sterling Bank under fire as investor considers pulling multi-billion holdings. Employees inside the bank refreshed stock tickers obsessively, watching as their value dipped lower and lower, each percentage drop a wound that bled morale across the building. Richard Sterling finally issued the order for a personal meeting with Darius, something unthinkable just days ago. And for the first time in his career, the CEO, who prided himself on commanding respect, was preparing to beg. The message was clear. If Sterling National Bank was to survive, they needed Darius's forgiveness, or at least his silence. What they didn't realize was that Darius had already decided the outcome, and their frantic calls were arriving far too late to stop what was coming. By the end of the week, the fate of Sterling National Bank was sealed. The grand skyscraper that once stood as a symbol of untouchable power now looked more like a fortress under siege, its lobby flooded with protesters holding signs that read dignity over dollars and no justice, no business. Television crews broadcast live from the steps, while employees inside walked the halls with their heads lowered, their futures uncertain. In the boardroom, Richard Sterling sat slumped in his chair, the weight of failure etched deep into his aging features. The delegation he'd sent to Darius had returned empty-handed. Polite words had been exchanged, but Darius had never agreed to a meeting. Instead, he let his silence speak, and that silence became a thunderous verdict. Overnight, Darius shifted his holdings quietly into Titan Financial and several smaller institutions that valued his presence, and the move spread like wildfire through the financial world. Stockholders panicked, clients fled, and within 48 hours, Sterling National's value had plummeted to a historic low. The final blow came when regulators announced a formal investigation, citing allegations of discriminatory practices and unethical management, charges that would not only drag Sterling's name through the mud, but also threaten its license to operate. Angela was dismissed in disgrace, escorted from the building under the gaze of television cameras, her face a mask of shame. Richard Sterling tried to hold one last press conference, his voice cracking as he insisted the bank would recover stronger than ever, but the world no longer listened. Across the city, in his penthouse office with its panoramic skyline views, Darius watched the coverage quietly. He hadn't spoken a word publicly, hadn't issued a statement, hadn't granted an interview, yet his decision alone had toppled an empire. His assistant asked if he wanted to respond to Sterling's plea for dialogue, but Darius simply shook his head. Some lessons, he murmured, almost to himself, must be learned the hard way. And as Sterling National's name dissolved into scandal and bankruptcy, Darius stood as proof that arrogance could undo even the most powerful institutions when respect and dignity were cast aside.